Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Reading Along with Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Today we'll finish the second half of the second question, which is, how is science even possible? Because he thinks it is, but the question is, how is it possible? So which is slightly different than one might imagine. It's normally framed, because normally people just assume that it is. Of course it's possible, it exists, but this is Kant's question. It's like, yeah, it exists, but how is it that it exists, given all of the complications, of course, that he introduces into the question of science? Before we jump in on that, I just want to make two notes on the whole mathematical question, which seems to be coming up a lot in comments, both on YouTube and on Patreon. So I thought it would just be worth a moment to reflect on what Kant is trying to do. So there's two different lines that seem to pop up. One is this question of, what does mathematics represent? And this is a question it kind of be boiled down to, in one way of saying, is mathematics discovered, which is to say it exists outside in the universe independent of humans, and that what we do with our reasoning and our intuition is we discover it. So it's there. Many mathematicians say this and use this kind of language, that you've discovered a solution, or you've discovered an insight, or you've discovered a theorem of mathematics. And so that implies like it's discovering an atom or discovering a new compound, right? That exists in the universe independent of humans. Or another approach to this is to say it is invented, that what mathematics is doing is it's a type of human intellectual game, and that because of the way our minds are structured, well, there's different ways to make this argument, but roughly because of the way our minds are structured, hello, Kant, we discover things that resonate or that map onto potential features of the universe. But it's just our human conception of those features, not those features themselves, not the thing itself, as Kant keeps saying. And in this case, what we're really doing is we're discovering the shape of our own minds. And therefore, mathematics is a creative process, an artistic, aesthetic process grounded in rationalism, grounded in logic, but grounded in the human conception and understanding of those things, not in any absolute insight. Now, this argument has been going on for a very long time, by the way. The Pythagoreans, if you go all the way back, well, not all the way back, but go pretty far back, in ancient Greece, the Pythagoreans sort of saw math as the insight into the absolute reality of the universe, right? They kind of worshipped math, amongst other things. And so for them, it was transcendental. For them, it did give you access to the highest possible types of knowledge. Whereas for many mathematicians, they just don't even care. It's an empirical question, right? They just say, does it work? Does it allow us to calculate what we want to calculate? Does it give us meaningful results? And meaningful in this sense being logically consistent and helpful in whatever it is we're trying to do. And so that division, that divorce has been going on for a long time. Now, what Kant does, and what we keep seeing here, is, of course, he comes down on the notion that, well, we don't really get access to absolute transcendental knowledge, right? He's never going to give us that. I hope everybody realizes that by now, because he sees the perceptual limits of the human mind as just that, an absolute limit. We have no way of getting out of that because we're always perceiving the world with our minds. However, what he's at pains to demonstrate, and one reason this becomes so complicated and confusing, is while refuting that on the one hand, he does say, and this is, I'm paraphrasing a little, maybe taking a little bit of liberty here, but basically he ends up arguing on this subject. He says, hey, but our minds, and this becomes important in the section we're going to look at today, are part of the universe. And so it's not like we have this thing that's outside the universe that we're trying to understand the universe with. We have a thing that's in the universe, that is made of the universe, that participates in the universe, that's we're trying to understand the universe with. Ipso facto, when we discover something absolutely about the mind, we have done something. So even that limitation maps onto something, and that gives us important and significant insight. But It just depends on how definitive and how transcendental you want to be functionally. And so he is not going to allow transcendental metaphysics. So he just says these are necessary limits of our perceptual apparatus. But in mapping them, we do learn a lot about the absolute nature of reality as perceived by humans, right? So it's always with that little caveat there that he puts in the footnotes. So hopefully that's clarifying on that one issue of what is Kant trying to do. And this is about part of a long-running argument, and really he brings it to the fore and has created problems for the foundations of mathematics ever since. The second one, is that people do say, hey, what part of 1 + 1 = 2 can you disagree with? And it's like, well, hello, Derrida, Wittgenstein, so on and so forth. Like, it turns out a lot. And so the problem here is we're so used to language that we feel that it is natural. And what, of course, Kant's trying to do is denaturalize. He's trying to make it strange. One reason it's so hard to read Kant is because he really is one of the first philosophers to really start digging in a painful ways at language itself. So he's always trying to redefine words and redeploy them and stretch their meaning and do all this because he's like, look, the language itself is part of the issue of what we're struggling with. And so when you say 1 + 1 = 2, the part of this that Derrida would disagree with would be, well, what do you mean by 1? And what do you mean by plus? And what do you mean by 1? And what do you mean by equals? And what do you mean by 2? Like, he's going to argue with every single thing that you have there because it's like, what does 1 refer to? If it refers to something in the world, well, now we have a correlation issue. Of course, now we're in a rabbit hole of correlation problems. If it refers to something that's in your mind, an abstract concept, well, now we're in all kinds of empirical trouble, right? So this creates, and then you have these coordination issues. Like, is this a serial thing that happens in time? This is why Kant is like, look, we have to have time. We just can't think without it. And then you have the whole identity thing. So why would these two random symbols, when put together with this other random symbol and this other symbol, end up creating this other symbol? Clearly, we're just playing some sort of language game. And if we're playing a language game, we have all the problems of language, which are, sort of incredible and difficult to overcome, let us say. And so the notion that it's simple to say something like, well, 1 + 1 = 2, it turns out like, no. Unfortunately or fortunately, the era in which one was able to unproblematically make claims like this has gone away. And one of the reasons it's gone away is because of the guy we're reading. This is why he's both so core and so frustrating, is because he takes away all of this kind of simplistic, transcendental, metaphysical thinking that it seems innate almost in the human process. We just love to do this, to appeal to, absolutes and unknowns and ghosts and spirits and all these kinds of gods and these things that are just beyond, literally metaphysical, which is, the title of his book here. And when we do that, part of the way we do this is with language. And one of the things we want to do is we want to pretend like the language doesn't matter and that it's perfectly transparent, that we never have any problems communicating with language. And of course, this is silly. And then once you start working on this, you realize how problematic it is. So, you can't do what Kant really wants to do and then actually removes from himself. This is interesting because he says, of course 1 + 1 = 2. But then later on he's like, well, what that really tells us is not very much. And it ends up being very limited, right? And so he hedges about on that. So while he gives it in the big print, then in the small print later on, he taketh away. And of course, building on his concepts, again, phenomenology, Derrida, Wittgenstein, many other thinkers have run into trouble here or raised the trouble here and said, look, this just does not work as easily and as transparently as one might hope. And so you just end up in this morass. So there you go. Two quick updates as we jump ahead. And I'll try to knock this chapter out. And one of the things to comment here before we just get rolling, so we're on section 18 to start off. And I'm going to move kind of quickly through here because he spends a lot of time circling the point and then giving it to us. So I'll skip some sections and go to his own summaries of what he's said. And remember, this is the summary of a much longer work, and then, much, much longer work. And so even in his summarized and clarified version of this work, it still just seems to me it needs some summarizing and clarifying, which is why we're here. So it's good. Gives us something to do, assuming he doesn't kill me, because it is a bit of a challenge. So beginning of 18, he just raises this very directly, and he says, okay, what are we trying to do? Empirical judgment, insofar as they have objective validity, are judgments of experience. Those, however, that are only subjectively valid, I call mere judgments of perception. Okay, so important distinction. The latter do not require a pure concept of the understanding, but only the logical connection of perceptions in a thinking subject. But the former always demand, in addition to the representation of sensory intuition, special concepts originally generated in the understanding, which are precisely what makes the judgment of experience objectively valid. Okay, so he's drawing this distinction here by saying, look, if you just are using your judgments of perception, as he calls it, the category, then you don't need any pure concepts or anything because you're just comparing experience to experience to experience. We're an empirical because it is actual experience that we're testing, but there's no higher order of reasoning or understanding, as he calls it, which means that this is just limited empiricism, which might just be like, okay, you ran 10 experiments and they all turned out one way. Does that actually mean the 11th one is going to not be different? White swan, white swan, white swan, white swan, all swans are white, black swan. Crap. But notice that we always talk about, people talk about the black swan event. And they go, oh, this is the problem with empiricism, right? Is that you all your empirical data may be correct, and yet along comes this thing that your empirical data didn't prepare you for. Two notes there. One is absolutely accurate. This is one of the limits of empiricism. Second note, however, this doesn't mean empiricism doesn't work. It just means it's not universally perfect, but it can still be really, really effective, right? See, this is what people get wrong, right? This is what Kant is on about metaphysics, is because, like, if you want metaphysical certitude, black swan events really throw you off, and you're like, oh my gosh, like we have to throw away everything. It's like, no, you don't have to throw away everything. That's to be absolutely expected because this is one of the limits of empiricism, but it doesn't mean empiricism doesn't work. Empiricism works spectacularly well. Planes fly. There's still a lot of debate about the laws of aerodynamics, but our planes fly very consistently. They're so great, right? This is the thing. So they're empirically, they work. They work with sufficient consistency that we're happy with them. Is our understanding perfect? No. Is it possible that our planes sometimes crash or we get stuff wrong? Yes. So these are different sorts of problems. It's when we try to exaggerate the certainty of empiricism and make metaphysical, i.e. transcendental claims for their outcome that Kant steps in and says, now you can't do that, right? You're not allowed to do that. When you can do this, in theory, according to Kant, when you can go beyond just the limits of empiricism is when it's related to a concept of our understanding. And the understanding is the part that steps in and makes it involves the absolute categories that come to us a priori. And then he moves on and just gives us great examples of this. He says, if the room is warm, the sugar is sweet, the wormwood repugnant, are merely subjectively valid judgments. I do not require that I should find it so at every time or that everyone else should find it just as I do. They express only a relation of two sensations of the same subject, namely myself, and this is only in the present state of perception and therefore not expected to be valid for the object. These I call judgments of perception. And you could refine these and refine these and refine these, but way beyond things like, oh, the object is sweet or the room is warm. But that doesn't change that basically you're just making a relation between you and an object that is not inherent necessarily in the object, but is in fact a judgment of perception, i.e., welcome to the world of empiricism. So, he immediately then goes on to clarify what he means by a judgment of experience. He says, I then require that this connection be subject to a condition that makes it universally valid, right? I want it, therefore, to be valid for me and for everyone else at every possible time would necessarily have to conjoin these perceptions under the same circumstances in the same way, right? How do we achieve universal validity? That's the question that he's asking. He says, normally we don't have it, and normally we don't necessarily even need it, but by God do we want it. So how is it that we go about constructing that when most of the time, most of our perceptions are clearly of just the vastly more limited empirical kind? And he gives us this, moderately unhelpful and vastly confusing chart in section 21, which we're just going to blow through. So because, you could argue about what he means by each of these categories and how they relate to each other and what these words mean and the translation of them. So we're just going to skip that because he then moves on in section 22 and 23 to give us some fairly, relative to Kant, clear summations of what he actually might be talking about here. And he says, and this is at the end of section 22, he says, therefore, pure concepts of the understanding are those under which all perceptions must first be subsumed before they can serve in judgments of experience, in which the synthetic unity of perception is represented as necessary and universally valid. So here it is. So there are pure concepts of understanding which basically subsume, gather up, organize all perceptions before those perceptions exist. And so this creates a unity of perception, is represented as necessary and valid universally. Remember, this is our goal. And so then he moves on, 23, judgment, insofar as they are regarded merely as the conditions for these unifications of given representations in a consciousness, are rules. So we have these rules of judgment insofar as they regarded merely as the condition for the unification of given representations. So these rules, insofar as they represent the unification as necessary, are a priori rules. This is what he's arguing for. So there are certain rules of thinking that are necessary for our perceptions to make certain connections. For instance, time. Before and after, cause and effect. So we have to have that. We have to have that rule. And so now we can talk about a principle, this rule, that is in fact a priori, because otherwise we can't think at all. And because we can think, there must be some structure that allows us to think, and that structure is the a priori in which we're looking. So it's not the judgments themselves. It is the structure that makes necessary judgments possible. Those are the rules, and that's where we get into the a priori. Hey presto, we've won. Yay. Now, the principle of possible experiences are, at the same time, universal laws of nature that can be cognized a priori. There it is. And so the problem that lies in our second question presently before us is, how is pure natural science possible is solved? For the systemization that is required for the form of science is here found to perfection. Since beyond the aforementioned formal conditions of all judgments in general, hence of all rules whatsoever furnished by logic, no others are possible, and these form a logical system. But the concepts based thereon, which contain a priori conditions for all synthetic and necessary judgments, for that very reason form a transcendental system. Finally, the principle by means of which all appearances are subsumed under these conditions form a physiological system, i.e. a system of nature which precedes all empirical cognition of nature and first makes it possible and can therefore be called a true universal and pure natural science. Wow. So that's section 23, and this is where he sums up every argument that he's made to date on how the natural sciences are possible. Because he says, how do you proceed from empirical experimentation, which is clearly just perception, right? And we know the perception can trick us. We know that it's limited, everything we talked about. But he says, now the principles of possible experience. So remember, so this is the realm of all possible experiences. So not the experiences we can have, but every possible imaginable experience. At the same time, universal laws of nature can be cognized a priori. And so the problem that lies in our second question is solved. How is pure natural science possible? So we can't have all experimentations. We can never be sure that there is no black swan, even if we've never seen one, because we may have just missed it, or one may evolve, or one may occur. But the perceptual apparatus that allows us to make perceptions like white and swan and make those connections, there are rules in that predate or precede our ability to even make logical connections. And those rules, that underlying order, is the actual subject of true natural science. It's not the stuff that they discover. It's not the specific empirical outcomes that are found. That's an outcome of the science. But pure actual natural science can happen because you can systematize. Form of science is here found to perfection, since beyond the aforementioned formal conditions of all judgment, blah, 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 no others are possible, and these form a logical system. But the concepts based thereon, which contain the a priori conditions for all judgments, necessary judgments, for that very reason, form a transcendental system. See, there can only be one logic. We can know the complete extent of it because we have the complete extent of thinkability, if you will. There's a horrible word. Kant is always making me try to form these horrible words that we don't have concepts for. But by the way, when you encounter concepts for which you don't have clear words, this is a hint that you're either thinking well or poorly. Because if you can think your way out of the standard vocabulary of your world, it can expand your mind, but it also might just be you're coming up with nonsense. Kant, I think, varies off and on there. But anyway, so now we're in the land of all being able to systematize all possible experience and derive from that all preceding possible logical connections. And so when we have any particular experience or set of experiences, we can organize them against this or on top of the connections that come to us a priori, even before we've had those experiences. And it's at that a priori level that there is where the natural sciences occur. So it's like mathematics, it's an a priori synthetic. It's a combination of things based on the a priori. And it's only when you put the thinking in and the connecting and the logic and the reasoning that all this empirical stuff actually becomes certain, which is interesting because usually science is presented the other way. So let's just pause there for a moment and remember this. Normally science, it says, you go from the evidence out, right? Whatever the evidence says, that's true, and then you just have to follow that wherever it leads. And Kant's like, no, this is just silly. This is not functional. By the way, as we were talking with the foundation of mathematics, so with the foundation of science, he really problematizes this kind of nonsense, this kind of very limited conception of how science works, because he's like, look, you can come up with a million different actual empirical research. This is not just shoddy science or incorrect science. It's like, no, you've gotten great result, great result, great result, great result, great result. It's all done perfect. You've got good data. It's all true. But just trying to follow the data will take you absolutely nowhere. It will make you determine that there is no such thing as white swans. Clearly that's just... no such thing as black swans, that they don't exist. We know this because we've run the experience 1 million times, 100 million times, and yet all of a sudden a black swan appears, and you're like, oh, okay, right? And he says you can't just follow the data. In fact, when you're just following the data, you're not really doing science, because that's going to be all synthetic perception, right? And we know that can mislead us, and we know how limited that is. It's when we make the connections, when we actually use these a priori cognitive forms that he has, that's when we're really doing. This is what makes science possible, and what makes it not just this limited, mundane, and potentially sort of, wildly misleading field. It's actually human cognition and judgment that gives it its power and makes it metaphysical to the point at which, to the extent that Kant will grant that to you. And so again, he boy, he's just right there because he's at the time, because he existed at a time when the sciences and mathematics and philosophy are sort of drifting apart. He can see much more clearly in some ways, I think, than we can today, the intellectual and philosophical roots that unite them. And he's like, look, this crazy sort of engineering notion of following the evidence, it just isn't going to work. It just is necessarily limited precisely in the ways that he has talked about. And so, don't fall for that trick. So once again, great. So Kant has given us this absolute structure that we can appeal to with synthetic ideas that allow us to take our experiences and raise their level beyond simply the mundane and limited. Then jump forward to section 30. Again, trying to move on a little bit here. And he says, consequently, even the pure concepts of the understanding, so this is the a priori necessary structure, have no significance at all if they depart from the objects of experience and want to be referred to in things in themselves. They serve, as it were, only to be spelled out appearances so that they can be read experience. The principles that arise from their relations to the sensible world serve our understanding for use in experience only. Beyond this, there are arbitrary conjoinings without objective realities whose possibility cannot be cognized a priori, and whose relations to objects cannot, through any example, be confirmed or even made intelligible, since all examples can be taken only from some possible experience or other, and hence the objects of these concepts can be met with nowhere else but in possible experience. Okay, so having given again, on the one hand, he says, look, even the pure concepts of understanding, which is the a priori thing that he's just given us, like look, this is how natural science is possible. If they depart from the objects of experience and want to be referred to things in themselves, to which he's already said we have no access, then that doesn't have any meaning. Even this category. So it's not that finding these categories on their own helps you out. They have to be referred back to the objects of experience. They're in a relationship. And it's the relationship of experience, empirical experience, and these categories of pure understanding that give us the power of natural science. Because he says, once you leave objective testing, once you leave empirical experience, well, now we're just back to religion, right? We're just back to what he started arguing against from the very beginning of this entire work, which is to say, look, if you just let me make up stories and I never have to verify them in experience, then I can make up any story. And there's no way to verify or falsify. Ipso facto, I can just, make up myths, make up stories. And that's exactly what he's trying to avoid. So, again, it's this strange move, and this is why it makes it interesting. I think why Kant's such a great thinker and makes all this work trying to figure out what he's saying so challenging, but because he keeps challenging us on both sides. Like, oh, you want to appeal to the absolute, to God, whatever you want to call the absolute. And Kant's like, no, that's got to be verified in empirical experience in the way science does it. If you want it to be meaningful, you need both. You can't just have one or the other. And when you just try to go with the one and say, this is all we have, we just have the evidence, now, see, that's going to mislead you. That's an easy argument. If you just try to go the other one, we can't prove it, we don't have the data, we don't have anything to verify this in experience, well, now you're outside because those absolute categories are actually what make experience possible. So if you can never have the experience of it, you're outside of this validity. So the example that sprang to my mind when I was reading this section in preparation for this is a complaint people make about string theory, is you can make mathematically logical, coherent, rigorous systems that make all kinds of predictions and claims about the universe, but if you can't check them and verify them, then, as Kant says, you're doing religion. You're not doing science. That one paragraph, or the combination of the two paragraphs we just read, state this as clearly as possible. He says you can do it, you can make up rules, you can play these word games, you can structure it this way, but if you can't verify it empirically in a way that we can share the evidence and, the classic empirical structures and arguments, then yeah, you're just doing pointless metaphysics, which I've just said you have to stop doing, or we should stop doing until we find out what the grounds of actual metaphysics are. And one of the grounds that he has for metaphysics, surprisingly, I would say, is verified through empirical experience. So he hedges both sides. He wants to limit what you can achieve with empirical experience. He wants to limit what you can do with transcendent validity or a priori access to absolutes. And then he says, when you have the combination of the two, this is where power resides. That's what makes natural science not just possible, but powerful, because it's this mix of cognition and empiricism that gives you the incredible, world-changing, transformative capacity of intellectual thought as trained under this kind of philosophical outlook. And he thinks also that this is the complete solution, as he said, of the Humean problem, though coming out of contrary to the surmise of the originator, thus restores the pure concepts of the understanding their a priori origin, and to the universal laws, nature, their validity as laws of understanding, but in such a way that it restricts their use to experience only, because their possibility is founded solely in the relation of the understanding of experience. Not derived from experience. This is the key. It's not that they're derived from experience, it's that experience validates the categories that we've created. And then you have this feedback loop. And that solves Hume's skepticism, which says we only know things from experience. We know there's things we can experience, and we know that sometimes we misunderstand our experience. So, boy, you're doomed. Kant says, nope, you're not doomed. There is a way out of this, and the way is that your experience is structured within these cognitive strategies that can be tested and can be understood absolutely. So, that's the gift of Kant's theory of how science works. And I want to emphasize again that if you actually have read, which I studied when I was in school for a while, one of the fields I was really focused on was the history and philosophy of science and its development. What you realize is, wow, science as practice and as discussed wants to avoid basically every question that Kant raises. So it's not even so much that I want to say, or that we need to even think that Kant is correct in his solutions to the problems he raises. But again, notice how powerful and how sort of shocking in some ways his questions are. It's like, wow, like the foundations of mathematics. No, I don't think so. The foundations of empirical experimentation, they don't really do what you think they do. Oh, let's imagine we had transcendental categories. That would solve our problems. He's like, no, this doesn't really solve your problems. He just attacks he just cuts the legs out of everything on every side. And so this sort of like, science has the answers, this sort of, the experiment showed this, therefore, it's science and we know. And he's like, no, it's always got to be this combination of human understanding from these precognitive structures that allow us to then apply and understand and interpret the empirical data. That's what he's always striving for. And notice again, this makes, sort of revealed religion as Kant is, as we generally understand it, Kant is criticizing and attacking it because he's saying, look, yeah, it could be true, but how do we test this? Right? Where would we get the empirical evidence for any of this? And so he's always going to ask that question for empirical evidence to try and verify and feed back into our metaphysical categories. And if we can't, if there's no way, you say, oh, well, it's just like faith. Basically, if you have to take it on faith, he's like, well, no. Like, that doesn't give you true metaphysics. It's not really an answer. He will go on, by the way, to say, well, he kind of makes these arguments. I'll save that for the end, but he does make these kind of strange defenses of religion. And he consistently in Critique of Pure Reason, like stops in the middle of arguments that completely eliminates any ability to have faith and says, oh, but of course, this doesn't say anything about faith. And, we know that we have a transcendent God and all this stuff. And you're like, what? And it's not clear whether he actually believed that, like his mind was sort of clearly partitioned, or if he was worried about the censors, probably both, or that he just felt like, well, that he really did have faith. He had faith in the sense of I can argue against all of this and then go, yeah, but I'm still good. Which of the above is true for him? It's not clear. So he goes on. There's more here. There's a lot more here, but I think we'll call it stop there for how transcendental, the main question of transcendental possibility of science, which is the second part. And the answer that he comes up with, to summarize, is you can have transcendental science because we have these precognitive relations and patterns, that rules that have to exist for us to construct any meaningful understanding of the world. And so those give us the a priori, but those only exist and are helpful when they're applied to actual experience. So it's a priori categories applied to actual experience allows us to use empiricism to construct scientific insight that goes far beyond the normal capacity of human thinking or human reasoning. That is what he wants to argue. Now, whether it's true, okay, there's a lot of space here to debate this. But again, in delivering this kind of critique that he does, he shows you that just relying on empirical output clearly does a lot less for you than you might think, and certainly doesn't ground science in any way. But also having access to these transcendental categories of necessary thought, Kant is consistent in saying, yeah, but remember, that's simply for us. This has nothing to do with the universe or the world. It's simply for the way our minds are structured, the way our perceptual apparatus are structured. We have to be able to think this way. And so natural science is an empirical map of the necessary cognition patterns of the human mind. And hopefully, with the empirical data, is what gives it the relationship to the universe. But it comes on both sides. So we have a mind in the universe shaped by participating in that gives us rules for how we have to perceive things and how we have to make connections. And those necessary rules allow us to take empirical data, experiences, sensory input, and translate them into these much larger claims that are effective and true, in air quotes there, and hence gives power to the natural sciences that he lived to see the evolution and blooming. Again, Newton being the great example, but it's on everywhere. Chemistry is coming on, physics is coming on, astronomy is coming on. Like all of these, all the technology is starting to grow. All the physical thinking about this is starting to happen. And it's like, wow, this is taking off. Where does this power come from? How can it be so effective and efficient? And he says, this is the key. And again, it's not that he's right, but it does give us powerful insight into all kinds of ideas and sort of thought patterns that we just take for granted, that the second you stop and look at them, you go, oh, wow, yeah, I think Kant is making a lot of good points. So thank you very much. And next time we'll be on to part 3.